What's going on, my beautiful people? Coach Will here. I hope all is well. And in this video, we're going to be discussing what sort of squat stance you should be using in order to optimize your squat movement. With that being said, if you are new here, be sure to leave a like down below, comment, subscribe, turn on post notifications, and do the whole thing. And even if you aren't new here, be sure to show some love down below. It really helps the channel grow so I could continue making videos like this each and every single day. Also, for my fitness beginners out there, check the online fitness coaching application down below so that way we can work together to help you make a plan of attack to hit your fitness goals today. So with all that out of the way, we're gonna get straight into the video. Now, when discussing what sort of squat stance will work for an individual, we have to understand that there is no such thing as one singular squat stance that is the best squat stance for somebody to be using. The thing is that there are a variety of different squat stances that may suit one individual over another individual. The reason for this is there are three key factors that go into what actually helps somebody optimize their squat movement. The first of which is having a good understanding of one's anatomy. What I mean by this is when we're discussing one's anatomy, this goes into their limb length. Some people have long femurs and short femurs. Some people have their hip sockets set up a certain way to where the way that the ball and socket joint moves with one another when you're performing a squat movement, this may require one stance or may favor one stance over the next stance. Another thing may also be what's going on at the person's feet. Is the person flat-footed? Is the person a normal arched? Is the person an overarcher? All these little things and then some will go into how they should actually stand in order to optimize their squat. Along with that, the second thing that goes into play is one's mobility. See, not everybody has the same exact hip mobility or ankle mobility or shoulder and thoracic mobility. See, when it comes to what's going on at the root, right, what's going on in our legs and our feet, due to the things that I said that have to do with anatomy, this can potentially lead to you or somebody you know having certain limitations when it comes to maybe their ankle mobility. So for example, myself, I'm actually flat-footed. With me being flat-footed, I have very limited ankle mobility. So because of this, I may have to turn my feet out a little bit more than say your average individual. On top of that, you may come across individuals who have extremely long femurs, and because of the long femurs, they also have to externally rotate the hips in order to create clearance in the ball and joint socket found in the hips in order to actually hit depth. And then you have another field of athlete or individual who they could have their feet perfectly pointed forward with very minimal toe flare, and they could squat up and down, no problem at all, no questions asked. A lot of these little details ultimately stem from one's anatomy, but also looking into their mobility is very, very key when we're looking at how they should optimize their squat stance. And lastly, when you put two and two together, this will lead us to our third and final criteria in which plays into how or what squat stance will be most optimal for you. And that is, where do you feel the strongest at? So this is very important because, for example, if you look at somebody like myself, right? I tend to be a fairly neutral stance squatter, so I'm not too wide, I'm not too close in. I'm right about in the middle. I guess you could say shoulder width apart, maybe slightly outside. Some days it's slightly closer in. You never know. Now, the reason for this is, even though, yes, I'm a flat-footed person, and most flat-footed people actually favor better with a wider stance and having the toes pointed out, this doesn't necessarily correlate with somebody like myself. The reason for this being is because when I go that wide and flare my toes out, my hips do not feel stable. This is because although I lack ankle mobility, I have extremely mobile hips. So because of that, I actually prefer having my stance a little bit closer in, whilst at the same time having a natural toe flare at about 30 to 45 degrees. Vice versa, if you take a good look at my friend Michael, you'll notice he has very long femurs, relatively short torso. He's not necessarily flat-footed, but because of that, he takes a naturally wider stance to help favor his hips in order to squat into optimal depth, or use in order to squat into an optimal range of motion. So this goes to show that when you look at one individual versus another individual, there is no which way, shape, or form in order to fully optimize the full spectrum of what is optimal for one's squat mobility. Now you may be wondering to yourself, how do I go about finding out what sort of squat stance is most optimal for myself or for somebody who want to help out? Well, there are 2 steps that you need to take in order to do this. The first step you want to take is you want to do a screening in order to address what sort of hip mobility you're dealing with, right? The way we do this is we'll either lie down on a bed, the floor, a mat, whatever it may be, and in doing so, you will actually keep one leg straight and then the other leg, you'll bend it and lift it towards your torso. In doing so, you'll find out just how far the knee actually travels towards the chest. The key with this drill is you want to make sure, or you want to find the position in which the ball and hip socket joint moves most freely. Depending on where this moves most freely, you'll notice that you'll have a position in which you're able to hit optimal squat depth, which is slightly below 90 degrees, without necessarily compromising the structural integrity of your hips. The second thing you want to do is a screening for your ankles. So you simply take a wall, you'll kneel down, or you can even do this standing, and what you do, you'll place your foot about 4 to 6 inches away from the wall, and you're gonna focus on driving your knee towards the wall without having the heel of your foot elevate off of the ground. In doing so, you'll find out 1 or 2 things. You'll find out, 1, if you have good or bad ankle mobility, and 2, you'll also find out, just like with the first hip screening, is if you have any sort of asymmetry on one side with the other side. Depending on what you may find out, this will help you with 1 or 2 things. 1, it'll help you out in terms of addressing any sort of muscular imbalances that you may have in terms of maybe having one side tighter than the other or one side not as mobile as the other. Secondly, it'll help you address what sort of squat stance is most optimal for you. So based on the screening that you did for both your hips and your ankles, this is the time now where you kind of plug and play. So based on the screening that you did for your hips and based on the screening you did for your ankles, you can kind of generally assess what position will be best for you. So if you're somebody whose knee was basically in a neutral position and you were able to bring it to your chest with no issue at all, maybe you'll fall more under the spectrum of being a closer stance squatter. So squatting with the stance that's about shoulder width apart, maybe slightly closer in. However, if you're somebody who has that stance based off of hip mobility, but you have jacked up ankles, maybe somebody like myself, maybe you need that stance and you need to turn your toes out just a little bit, about 30 to 40 degrees. So that way you give your hips the clearance that it needs on top of making sure that you're able to work around your ankle mobility as you continue to adapt it. Vice versa, maybe you're somebody, maybe you have horrible hip mobility but great ankles. If you have horrible hip mobility but great ankle mobility, you probably need to go wider out, but maybe the amount in which you actually turn your toes out will be limited. So sometimes when you're wider out, most people have super wide toe flare. However, this position, based on how one's anatomy is set up, may not be optimal. Maybe instead of having like a wide stance and then like a 40-degree toe flare, maybe you have a wide stance, but maybe something like a 20-degree toe flare. So this way, you're in an optimal position to where your ankles are able to move as they normally move, and your hips are actually in a good position to produce the most amount of power possible whilst allowing you to actually hit squat depth, that being slightly below 90 degrees, where the ball and hip socket joint is slightly below the knee. Or vice versa, let's say you're somebody who has crazy hip mobility and crazy ankle mobility, then at this point it's kind of like free game for you. Let's say you're just optimal, so you're just built to squat. Some people are just built to squat. Then at this point you could kind of plug and play and see what variation you just like best. It doesn't necessarily matter. So this is where you kind of go into the play of like trial and error and just seeing what squat stance you like the most. Like, do you prefer squatting the traditional toes pointed forward, knees pointed forward, butt down, squat straight back up, or would you prefer a more wider stance for your troubles and just kind of do the same exact modality? So depending on where you fall in the sort of spectrum of squat mobility for your hips and your ankles, this will ultimately dictate what sort of route you go into in terms of choosing a squat stance that best suits you and your squat needs. With that being said, my beautiful people, that is it. So just to recap, the 3 things that go into addressing our full spectrum in terms of what goes into optimizing our squat stance. The first is our anatomy, the second is our mobility, and the third is where we feel most comfortable based on trial and error. Once you also, to follow off of that, once you do the 2 screenings in terms of addressing your hip mobility as well as your ankle mobility, this will allow you to dictate what sort of direction you need to go in or what sort of steps you need to start taking starting today, so that way you can help optimize your squat stance, so that way the squat is no longer an issue for you. So with all that out of the way, my beautiful people, I hope this video helped you out a ton with your squat. If it did, definitely leave a like down below, let me know. Also comment down below on what you would like to see me go over next. Subscribe, turn on post notifications, and do the whole thing. And for those of you interested in online coaching with myself, the link is in the bio, so that way you can apply for it, so we could start working together starting today. And with all that out of the way, my beautiful people, in Will We Trust? Until next time.